Hello, welcome to the Fulani Show. I'm Dr. Lenora Fulani. Joining me is my co-host, Dr. Fred Newman. Welcome back to our guest, Richard Rorty. Dr. Rorty is a distinguished American philosopher who teaches at the University of Virginia. He's the author of 11 books, which have been translated into more than 15 languages. His two most recent books are Achieving Our Country, Leftist Thought in 20th Century America, and Truth and Progress, Philosophical Papers 3. They will both be published this spring. Last week we just barely touched the surface of these interesting books, and we're really pleased to have Dr. Rorty back with us again. Welcome.
Thank you.
In Achieving Our Country, you talk a lot about the left of the 1990s, or since the Vietnam War. You say the left should declare a moratorium on theory. Could you say more about what you mean by that?
What I meant was that a great deal of energy or a great deal of libido in the American Academy goes into sort of deep theoretical analyses of our culture, our historical situation, and so on. And it seems to me this is distracting the students from the issues of the day. It's hard to get the students who read a lot of Foucault, for example, to worry about anything as simple as national health insurance or the minimum wage or immigration policy or NAFTA or something like that. It's as if students interested in leftist politics immediately got caught up into theoretical, philosophical questions and spent course after course discussing, different theoretical analyses of contemporary America, contemporary Western society, and so on. And it's hard to get them interested in concrete pieces of legislation, concrete initiatives. You tell them there's something like the new party being organized, some grassroots political effort, and they find it hard to make a connection between that and reading somebody like Lyotard or Baudrillard, French thinkers on American culture. So when I said a moratorium on theory, what I meant was it would be nice if people on the left talked more about laws that had to be passed and less about the nature of modernity or the nature of postmodernity or hegemonic culture versus minority culture and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So again, I know I'm pursuing this unreasonably from last week, but I'm so interested in it, I'd love to hear your thoughts about it. You don't think that there might be a way in which the philosophical, other philosophy, let's say more pragmatic philosophy, might be more conducive to seeing a connection between philosophical conceptions and the lack of a national health policy? You're still...
Yeah, I just don't see much of a connection. I think for most of us in national politics are just simple-minded utilitarians. We think that all you have to know about morality is try to increase human happiness if you can do it without hurting too many people. And it seems to me, enough philosophy to get by with in thinking about national politics. So it isn't that Dewey didn't do a lot to say things like, America doesn't need a religious foundation, it doesn't even need a theoretical foundation, it just needs autonomy and self-confidence. So that was a useful thing for a philosopher to say. But Dewey's politics, which were sort of standard liberal social democratic politics, floated free from that particular philosophical position. Dewey's own philosophical opponents often shared his politics, and it didn't make any difference that they disagreed about philosophy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Something I'm very eager to take a look at, and maybe it does or doesn't connect to this, I don't know, is the whole concept of truth, which American pragmatists, and certainly you have spent a great deal of time writing about. Obviously the notion of truth, as you well know, and most of our viewers know, predates modern science by millennia. What's the attraction? This might seem a strange and hard question to get. What's the attraction of truth with a capital T, a small t, whatever. What's that about?
The reason philosophers make such a big deal out of it is since Descartes, it's sounded like a good question. You know, how does what goes on in my head relate to what goes on outside my head? How does the subject relate to the object? How does the mind relate to the world? And so on. And Dewey had a nice simple answer to that. He said, don't think of us as having a mind, don't think of us as having ideas in our head, think of us as an organism, think of us as organisms trying to cope with our environment. And we use language and linguistic behavior and social communication as tools for coping with our environment. And the question to be asked about any given belief is it going to help us cope with our environment? The philosophers who were Dewey's opponents said, no, there's another question, namely, is it true? Does it correspond to reality? And Dewey spent his life saying, you know, who cares? You know, what is this thing called correspondence with reality? We have tests for adopting beliefs. You know, we have tests for adopting beliefs about politics, tests for adopting beliefs about physics. We know what we want out of physics. We want an account of how things work that helps us get what we want out of things. We know what we want out of politics. We want, for instance, to relieve human suffering. You know, we adopt principles, beliefs, policies as tools to achieve these goals. The question, yes, but do they correspond to something non-human? You know, the moral law, the will of God, the intrinsic nature of reality, is a question we can just skip. And the argument about whether we can, in fact, skip that question is that's where most of the heat comes from when philosophers talk about truth.
But do you think, just for a moment being a devil's advocate, do you think there is if you will, a pragmatic need that human beings appear to have, if one stuck, for some kind of religious relationship to the world, and that's a part of this whole thing?
Well, there certainly has been, and Dewey thought we might outgrow it. That is, he thought once upon a time, you know, we didn't just ask about human happiness. We asked, does God want us to be happy, or are we, you know, so sinful that, you know, we don't deserve to be happy? And he suggested it was time we forgot about what God wanted and just, you know, worked on our own happiness.
Right.
And similarly, in Truth and Science, he was saying, let's forget about the question, how is reality in itself apart from human needs, interests, language, and so on, and just say what scientific language will be more advantageous than which other scientific language. Newton had obvious advantages over Aristotle. Einstein had obvious advantages over Newton. We know what the advantages are. The question whether any of them were close to reality isn't something we need to worry about. And so there is it's a quasi-religious need to be in touch with reality, the way religious people need to be in touch with God. And Dewey thought it was two aspects of the same need, but he thought it was an immature need, you know, a need that eventually the human race would evolve out of having.
But how, again, to pursue this somewhat, how is that position of Dewey's that you're just describing, is that a pragmatic position?
Yeah.
That it's an immature need?
It's not a clever device for getting something done. It's a suggestion about a sort of vast social experiment to be performed. And in the 18th century, the so-called Enlightenment philosophers said, look, maybe we can get along without religion. You know, maybe society doesn't need this. Maybe we can make it with just science and politics. Skip God, skip the churches, and so on. Well, at the time, it sounded crazy. It sounded unpragmatic. You know, because, you know, in the past, you got things done by appealing to Scripture, for example. Dewey said, well, if we could do it once, maybe we can do it again. That is, if we can overcome the impulse to rely on something non-human, the way 18th century secularism suggested we do it in the field of morals, maybe in philosophy generally, we can get rid of the idea of corresponding to the nature, will, whatever, of something non-human. And maybe it would work and make us better than we were before. Dewey thought that a secular society was better than a fundamentalist religious society. Morally better, more grown up. And he thought a pragmatist society, that is a society which took a sort of pragmatic view of truth for granted, would be more grown up and morally better than a society that kept asking itself, gee, am I in touch with reality?
But do you find it, to me it's somewhat interesting that even though religion in a way is more in an immediate sense, useful in people's lives. People do religious things, talk religious talk, are motivated more and more than they are by reality talk, perhaps. One could make that case. Reality has, in the sense what you're describing, outlasted religion. It persists, even though some people, at least there was a moment when religion seemed to be on the wane. Reality, it seems to me, has never been on the wane.
Well, I'm not sure about that.
Yes.
I mean, religion has been on the wane in countries where there was more money, leisure, freedom, peace than there has ever been in the world before. People need religion when things are really tough and life on earth seems hopeless. They hope, well, maybe there's another world where life will be better. It seems to me that if you say, we gradually drop the need for appeal to the non-human when human happiness increases. Dewey is pretty convincing when he says, yeah, and eventually we might drop the whole idea of reality as a standard to which we must conform and just start thinking about reality as the environment which presents us with problems to solve. And Dewey has no objection to reality as we got problems. We're always going to have problems. He just had an objection to it as that which is out there, possibly hidden from us, possibly invisible to our limited minds, stuff like that. Reality conceived as a sort of version of God.
I was gonna, the whole issue that we spoke a little bit about in the first show, relative to the left and its lack of pride in our country. And you're saying that the left needed to move beyond that. When I was reading about that, I was thinking about conversations that I've had, for example, with black leaders and also liberals in the country who speak about racism in a way that keeps us, in my opinion, trapped in it, and trying to get them to move beyond how it is that they sort of envision or frame dialogues about racism, because I think it also has an impact on our capacity to do something about it. And I think that's a very difficult thing to get people to do who have sort of gotten their niche carved out as a result of defending certain things in our country. So what do we do while they're still having these debates or being less prideful? Or like, what are people supposed to do in order to move forward?
Well, you might say be pragmatic. And people like Todd Gitlin and Joel Rogers are saying, look, we need majoritarian politics, because African Americans aren't going to get what they want, white members of trade unions aren't going to get what they want unless they're part of a united majoritarian left. And we got to think of ourselves as American leftists first, with this particular leftist agenda item always coming second. And I think this makes sense. This debate came into the open at a labor teach-in they had at Columbia a year and a half ago. It was a bunch of academics, John Sweeney, the head of the AFL-CIO, a lot of students, representatives of local labor unions. Gitlin gave a speech based on his book, The Twilight of Common Dreams, saying, cultural politics is not really what you need if you want a working majority in Congress. So let's think about what it would take to get a working majority in Congress. What it would take would be dreams that stretch across identities, dreams that one has as an American rather than as a special kind of American. And a lot of the black speakers at the Congress got extremely angry at Gitlin, saying that this was the effect of carrying out his recommendations would be to tear down all the structures of black socio-political organization that had grown up since the civil rights movement, and that it was just too risky for the African Americans to join this majoritarian coalition he had in mind. And they had a point, but I wish at least the point were being discussed more than it is, because it seems to me the central issue for the left. How much of the gains since the King years can we keep after trying to recreate a leftist coalition based on the trade union movement, imitating the one we had in the 50s.
Mm-hmm. One thing, I guess what I was curious about is if we had to wait for the left, is if you saw a movement around Pride in America as coming from people who don't think of themselves as leftists. Like we've been supporters of the term limits movement. And whether people like or don't like term limits, I don't think is the real issue, but millions of Americans, all kinds, a majority of them have supported it. And I mean, maybe that's where the thrust is going to come from, or is coming from, and the left has to catch up with that.
I guess I think that there are other things that it could center around, like, for instance, national health insurance. And this is something that everybody needs, except the white middle-class suburbs who've already got it. Mm-hmm. And if we could incite a little more class warfare by saying, look, the country is divided into the people who have health insurance and the people who don't cut across all kinds of divisions. I'd prefer to stick to sort of economic welfare state issues and make them central. Health insurance, local financing of school systems, stuff like that. Sort of simple economic injustice that's curable by legislation.
Yeah. We had Robert Reich on the show, as we mentioned earlier, a few weeks ago. And again, I was thinking about him as you were talking, and he was saying, and in his recent book, and also he was saying here on the show, that raising those kinds of issues, or attempting to raise those kinds of issues in the Clinton cabinet, in the heart of American federal government, was virtually impossible.
Yeah.
That people just, it wasn't even entertained.
Yeah.
So I guess I wonder what you think about that, and what chance the left has in some ways of getting into that debate when he can't affect, and he was selected to be there, any kind of dialogue on the current distribution of wealth, for example, not allowed. I mean,
yeah, I like a lot of other people, I'm sort of baffled by the Clinton administration. That is, it seems to me Clinton got an enormous boost in the polls when he said he was going to give us national health insurance in the '92 campaign. He did his best, you might say, but then, that was quite a while ago, right. And we haven't heard anything about it. And, I wish that in the closing years of the second administration, he would get back to some of those things he talked about in '92 and, bring them to the front. Mm-hmm. I guess I just don't understand why it hasn't happened.
Yeah. I guess the point that I'm making, though, Richard, I wonder if you think about this, is that one could make out a case, maybe think about our discussion here, that the left in America has become unduly pragmatic on these issues and has been, first of all, a lot of the left publications, a lot of left, in the broader sense of the word as you use it, supported Clinton.
Right.
So and yet it doesn't happen. They won't even entertain these kinds of issues. So,
yeah, Clinton, it seems to me, has all the right social democratic views. He's a thoroughly intelligent, thoroughly decent president, and somehow he hasn't done it. Yeah. And this is what baffles me.
It's a puzzle.
And I don't think of it as pragmatism versus principles. I think of it as centrism versus leftism. Mm-hmm. I think Clinton has a lot more room to be on the left than he's taken advantage of.
Right. Yeah. And why doesn't he?
I don't know.
It's a puzzle.
Yeah. I mean, he's acting as if he were going to run for election again, or as if, if he ever mentioned national health insurance, it would imperil Gore's candidacy. I think it would help Gore's candidacy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's a philosophical puzzle, or some kind of puzzle.
Yeah,
some kind.
I find the administration genuinely mysterious. I mean, I admire the president, but I have a feeling he's going to have served 8 years and nothing will happen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
One of the issues you raise is the problems of globalization, which extend beyond our borders. What do you think the American left can do about those kinds of problems?
At least keep them under discussion. I mean, the unions at least have said, think about NAFTA. Don't just preach free trade forever. Think about what's going to happen in the short term and whether the country can rescue the people whom NAFTA is going to endanger. And if we could discuss in detail the question, how much can we afford to do for the Southern Hemisphere, for the Third World, and how much, on the other hand, do we have to do for the unemployed and people employed on minimum wage in America? That's something we have to talk about sooner or later, but nobody at the moment is talking about it. And the left acts as if we could somehow pour money into the Southern Hemisphere and also pour money into what, the Rust Belt, Appalachia, and so on, and we can't. So sooner or later, some politician is going to have to talk facts and figures about the consequences of globalization for the domestic economy. I'm not an economist, so I don't have any, really nice, clear views on the subject, but it seems to me such an important issue for the next few decades and subject to such little discussion that it makes American politics a little crazy that nobody's talking about it.
Yeah. Let me shift gears a little bit here, since you've done so many things, written about so many things, and this might seem a strange and naive question, but what do you like about being a philosopher? What made you a philosopher, and why are you still a philosopher?
I just got turned on by certain books. You go into an academic discipline because at a certain crucial age you read a book that excites you, and you say, hey, if that's what it means to be an historian, I'll be an historian. If that's what it means to be a political scientist, I'll be a political scientist. And with me it happened to be philosophy books.
Which books did you read? Remember some of the earliest things?
Nietzsche, Plato, Hume, sort of, usual great philosophy.
So classical philosophy.
Jacques Maritain at one point. Miscellany of stuff.
Now you've been, as a philosopher, you've been someone who's gone to a lot of different places. In fact, a lot of places that you were just talking about at Princeton, places where, I mean, the country and probably the world, I don't know, but at least in this country, philosophy departments have tended over the last, 20, 30 years at least, to be divided into, the analytic philosophers, the continental philosophers. You've gone to a lot of different places and worked with, read, been inspired by people from how has that happened? I mean, I don't know what's the...
In my case, it was
secret?
just I sort of got bored with analytic philosophy, so I began to teach. I began to teach recent French and German philosophy just to give myself something different to do, and eventually it became a habit. So now I mostly teach so-called continental philosophy.
Why don't more people get bored by analytic philosophy? I've wondered that for 40 years now.
Well, it's I think it's very much like for example, constitutional law. Extremely intelligent people go into analytic philosophy, like extremely intelligent law professors go into constitutional law, and you have a kind of club of really smart people talking to each other, and after a while they just don't care whether anybody's listening. So you get very high-powered discussion within an area that ought to be relevant to what's going on in the rest of the world, but quite often isn't. I mean, for instance, Judge Posner in the court in Chicago has written a book saying there's too much constitutional law in the law schools. It's a terrific intellectual exercise, but it has no interest for us judges. It doesn't matter for society how you interpret the Constitution. So why don't you get off the dime and talk about something else? And that's sort of my feeling about analytic philosophy, that it's a tremendous, it provides tremendous opportunities for intellectual pleasure, but it's become so self-involved by this time that it's sort of no wonder that you can't get students to take the courses anymore.
I'm sorry.
I wanted you to announce your upcoming conference.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, we have this conference coming up in Virginia, Charlottesville, the 19th to the 21st of May, called Does America Have a Democratic Mission? And it's questions like, are we ever going to start trying to become a classless society, which we once thought we might become? Do we still have any moral status in the eyes of the world? Are we still some kind of example for anybody? Should we be any kind of example for anybody? So we have 18 journalists, scholars, social commentators coming to talk about this.
Okay, and all of us are invited to come.
Absolutely. Free, open to the public.
Oh, great, great. Do we have time for one quick question?
Yes.
Just the notion, the kind of, is this an utter naive, idealistic notion that analytic philosophy, or philosophy more generally, but in particular analytic philosophy, can help people to think better, to understand better? Does that have any merit at all?
Oh, sure. I mean, it does help you think better. For that matter, studying law helps you think better.
Mm-hmm.
You know, studying Latin grammar helps you think better. I mean, you know, they're good, solid intellectual exercises.
But philosophy has no special
Not that I
claim
can see,
to fame.
you know, I mean, a lot of the philosophical issues discussed in analytic philosophy departments, particularly in moral and political philosophy, are also discussed in the law schools, and particularly in the law review articles in the law reviews. For one reason, because a lot of PhDs who couldn't get jobs went into law and became law professors, and are doing exactly what they would have done if they'd gotten PhDs. The quality of discussion in analytic philosophy departments on philosophical topics isn't any higher than in the law schools. Mm-hmm. And it's just, you know, the quality of discussion depends on how bright the people are, and analytic philosophy departments are good, but they're not, you know, they don't stand out above the rest of the university in any special way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It was great to have you. Thank
Very
you.
nice to have
Thank
you.
you for
Thank
coming.
you so much for coming.
We're out of time. Thanks for joining us this week. We'd love to get your comments and questions. You can reach me by calling the telephone number on your screen, or you can visit us online. Our website is www.fulani.org. This is Lenore Fulani saying take care of yourself. I'll see you next week.